Hey everybody, so I'm back with another review, and this time we're going to be talking about Deadshot Bulletproof, which is a 5-issue miniseries written by Christos, Gage, and as you can tell from the title, it stars Deadshot, but there's no Suicide Squad characters in here, there's no Secret Six stuff, it's just a straight-up Deadshot story, the same way the 1980s miniseries by John Ostrander is a straight-up Deadshot story, and it works almost as a pseudo-sequel to that story, because it makes a lot of references to it. It recaps the origin presented in that version, and it does, it tries to reconcile the fact, and even introduces this as well, but most people know that Deadshot has, in most modern incarnations, a daughter that he gives all his money to. Well, this is where that comes from, and the book tries to reconcile why Deadshot in that book would have a son that was molested and killed, and how that relationship changes and becomes what it is here. And so it has to do a lot with Deadshot's psychology and moving that forward, or at least it's supposed to do that. If people don't already know, I'm a really big fan of Deadshot. I love him as a character, and the 1980s miniseries by Ostrander, which I actually reviewed with Dan Torrey on Geekvolution for our show, and I'll put a link to that in the description. But that miniseries is one of my all-time favorite, just comics in general. It's a really well-told story. It's a very fascinating study of the character, and if you don't understand why Deadshot's such a good character, that's the place to go. So I was really excited going in to read this, and needless to say, I'm a little disappointed. It's not that it's bad or anything, it's just so by the numbers and kind of bland. So it's supposed to reconcile this psychology of Deadshot, and it never really does that. Deadshot in the previous miniseries has this thing where he's on a mission, and this book starts the same way, where he's on a mission and he gets news that's family related. And he finds out that his ex-wife's trying to get in touch with him because their son's been kidnapped. So Deadshot just kind of apathetically goes out and says, well, let me go figure out what happened with my son. And he just keeps doing things, damn the consequences, and he just keeps moving, and he's got this slight sense of emotion that all bursts out at the end, and it's all just psychologically driven by the nature of his family, of parents that he hated that forced him to kill the brother that he idolized, and they recap that here, and it's all really fascinating stuff. So here he learns he has a daughter, and he doesn't have the same apathetic outlook for her or her family. Now, it makes sense what he does, which is essentially he goes to the neighborhood for a while and decides to clean it out and just kill all of the criminals and everyone plaguing that area. And that makes sense. That's well enough within Deadshot's character. But this whole relationship, this whole different, much closer relationship he has with the mother of his daughter and his daughter, is something that's never completely addressed or fully understood. One of the other things about the other Deadshot miniseries is that his wife really wants to be close, and she can't understand why he's so distant, and even after their son dies, he doesn't really care about going back to her. It's never really about her in his mind. So his sort of fondness and almost pseudo-family that he develops here seems to come out of nowhere, and even if you don't have that history of the character, even if you don't read that miniseries, in this, it just doesn't seem to gel. It doesn't do a lot to explain how Deadshot psychology manifests in his day-to-day behavior, and so you never really get a sense of what changes or what develops to make him want this family, or to even desire it, or even to consider quitting his job as a mercenary. So it doesn't... It's not that it's vague on it, it's just that it keeps telling you that this is what's happening, this is what's happening, this is what's happening, and it never develops those ideas any further. It doesn't really show you those things that it wants you to feel in the same way that something like is something I said in my Green Lantern reviews of Jeff Johns, is that he always has a very clear picture of the emotion he wants you to feel. And he's always constantly describing it. He's just really bad at making the story speak for itself, and that's kind of what this is. And that's my big strike against it, and that's where the disappointed feeling comes in. Otherwise, it's a really interesting story, just from a perspective of what the DC universe is like. So you get this scene because the neighborhood that Deadshot's daughter and him live in is in Star City. So you get this scene where after Deadshot's cleaning up the neighborhood, killing all the criminals and such, it draws the attention of Green Arrow. So Green Arrow and Deadshot have a really great fight. It's an absolutely magnificently done fight, and they've got great sort of repertoire with each other, and it's handled with as much respect for both characters as possible. And they both, since they both have the whole can't miss kind of gimmick, they both have a very great respect for each other's capabilities. And then you get to this point where Deadshot says that you don't understand why I'm here, and all the people in the neighborhood defend him, and they're all standing up for him. They think Green Arrow is the bully. So they decide to have a talk. And it's not one of these rooftop chats. It's not one of those standard superhero fare of hiding in a back alley and just talking with your hero or villain counterpart. They just go to a restaurant, and in costume, they're just kind of sitting there, eating chili and stuff, and playing darts and talking. And they're completely in costume. It's really funny, and the people in the restaurant kind of leave to give them space, but otherwise, it's just a very homey feel. It doesn't feel the need to apologize for the fact that it's the DC universe and that there's comic books characters and they all wear costumes. It's just completely open about that. And part of why it also works is because the art's so, not cartoony, but very colorful and very open, and there's a great sense of you're doing the golden age, but a little bit more seriously, a little bit more sophisticatedly, and that's part of the great love you have. There's good moments of levity all the way throughout, and a lot of that just comes from the book being able to carry that tone throughout the whole story. Another great moment being that Deadshot has to watch his daughter for a little while, and his girlfriend says that, don't worry, she'll be asleep the whole time. So he walks across the hall, and there she is, just standing there, his daughter staring up at him, and he's got both of his hands on his head just screaming, and he's horrified because now he has to take care of a child. And then at the same time, at the end of the scene, you get this extremely tender moment where Deadshot is singing to his daughter, and you forget for a few minutes that this guy sees himself as the personification of the bullet, that he is the immoralist, so that moralist can't exist. You forget for a second that Deadshot's got such a death wish in him. And that's primarily where this book shines. It really gives you a sense of Deadshot's a human being. It doesn't handle the psychology well, but it handles the fact that there's natural desires, there's natural drives of all people that Deadshot just can't escape from. And you get a lot of other characters kind of telling you what you should understand from those, or what you should interpret from those moments, and that's, again, part of why the writing doesn't necessarily work. But it's still interesting enough, and it's nowhere near the league of that original Deadshot mini. But it's a good follow-up in the sense that you're getting a good taste of why this character fits in this universe, of why a guy with guns and a can't-miss personality or a can't-miss gimmick is able to be in league with people like Batman and Superman and be the most valuable member of any group of supervillains. It makes a really good case for why Deadshot is so deadly, without feeling the need to be very realistic or grounded in any sense. And there's a moment where Deadshot just fights as many supervillains as possible in a warehouse, and he holds his own easily. He fights a guy that's bulletproof and still finds a way to shoot through him. It's a very good account of why you don't need hyper-realism in comic book characters, because there's always a way to make that work as long as you're consistent with the tone. There's not a lot else I wanted to mention, because it's not an especially deep story, and I kind of wish it would be a little bit more. But you know, again, that's still all right for it as its own piece. It's not bad at all. It's just that in places you kind of wish you could get to the Ostrander style psychological aspects a bit more. The other big thing I wanted to mention is that there's a bit of commentary on socioeconomic status in the book, because the neighborhood that Deadshot's daughter lives in is a really rundown place, and there's three mob groups vying for it. There's the traditional Russian mafia, which is just called the Russians. You've got Mexican influence, and you've got one other urban street group, and they're all trying to take over this one little corner, and so it's called the Triangle. And because of that, the neighborhood is run by them. Police are owned by them, and it's about as corrupt as you can get, but corrupt in almost a cartoony way of like, yeah, everyone acknowledges this place is terrible, and everyone falls asleep hearing gunshots, but it doesn't try to be overly depressing about it. So Deadshot comes in, and his style, his sort of acts of heroism are as simple as just shoot anything that's bad, and he kills a ridiculous number of people, a ridiculous number of criminals, all because he wants to clean up the neighborhood. Green Arrow saying that you can't simply go around and play judge, jury, and executioner like that, and you get that scene that I mentioned before where everyone in the town or in the neighborhood speaks up for Deadshot, and everyone is supportive of him. They treat him like he's their Batman. And it's interesting because Green Arrow can't support what he's doing, but he also can't get rid of him, because there is an unmistakable sense of effectiveness to it. And when he does this, when he's able to clean up all of these streets, you get to this point where a lot of rich people are moving in, and the property value is going up, and it becomes a rich neighborhood. It becomes a bigger place, and so Green Arrow is able to patrol it more. But part of the interesting thing here is that it's attempting to comment without actually making any sort of definitive statements, but just in a sort of "did you ever notice" kind of way. It's saying that the idea that criminals can get away with whatever they want because people don't have any status, and yet if you do even the slightest misdemeanor in a rich neighborhood, someone can just make a phone call and ruin your life. To get to this point where at the end of the story, one of the police officers says that before I could, because I was getting paid, I could just do whatever I want. I could help anyone I choose to. I could not help anyone I choose to. And if the people felt like standing up to me, it wouldn't matter because the system was all reinforced by me. Now that it's all rich, now that there's all these quote-unquote important people, they even make a big point of saying that it's all rich white people. He says that now if I try to do that, if I even so much as try to ignore a cry for help from a rich white woman, all she has to do is call into the station and lodge a complaint, and I'm completely gone, and the system's completely self-corrected. And it's all about the majority and the people that have the money, and Deadshot being able to count himself among them, and is kind of helping them move in and control the neighborhood, but all for the interests of the minority. So you get this interesting point where it raises the question of whether or not the majority makes the right decision morally. There's a bit of a problem that the majority is able to dictate the conditions under which the minority live in, and that's kind of an endlessly fascinating concept. Again, I wish it was developed a little bit more, because this is more of a fun story than it is any kind of deeper story. But all of that's still there, and all of that's there far more subtly and far more almost as if Christos Gage is saying that I wish I was able to write more of that as opposed to the endless fight scenes. And yeah, that's definitely one of the highlights of the book. And the other thing I wanted to mention is what Deadshot does works. Deadshot going around and just killing criminals works. And so you get to this point where if someone reads this and they don't have context for other superheroes, they're thinking, at least for the first couple issues, why doesn't Batman just kill? Why doesn't Superman just kill? Clearly it's working. And the problem you run into is as long as you keep killing, you're not making a statement that killing's okay. You're making a statement that the strongest survives, or the people with the most bullets survive. So you get a sense of escalation that will be perpetuated until someone with a bigger gun shows up and is able to take you out. And then the interest of the stronger rules the neighborhood in the same way that it did before. So it's not really justice, it's just the interest of the stronger. And it's not a good concept to build off of. And it's an even worse concept for the example that it sets for people. So Deadshot has to eventually lead the neighborhood, because it's not going to get better as long as he's around, leaving so many bodies and buildings burning, because people will constantly be vying for the power he has, almost as if he's the boss of the neighborhood, despite not wanting the neighborhood to have a boss. And then it supports the counter argument, or it supports the argument for why superheroes shouldn't kill. And it's because even if you have more crime, in the long term, you've also got less people willing to break the law because of the example that's being set. Because you can look up to Batman in a way you can't look up to Deadshot, and you can fear Batman on a different level than you fear Deadshot. And there's a story at the end of this, a Detective Comics story. Not actually sure who it's written by. It might actually also be Christos Gage, but it doesn't seem to say in my reprint here. And it talks a lot about how Batman's mythology is what scares people, and that's sort of what you might do is terrifying, but what's even worse is what you know people will do. And so Deadshot's ability to just kill anyone he's hired to kill is far more terrifying than the threat of what Batman might do. And you get that kind of argument going there, but then at the end of the story you realize that, yeah, that's terrifying, but because it's such a projected fear, because it's just such a limited scope of what you can do, there's not a lot of room to maneuver or make things better, or to stand for anything more than just that. And so the killing on the side of superheroes, or just killing as a sense of justice, or the interest of the stronger as a sense of justice, doesn't work, because it just perpetuates the problem. And that's a really cool idea. The Detective Comics issue at the end of the story, collected in the Deadshot Bulletproof trade, isn't great. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not a Detective Comics story. It's actually Batman Legends of the Dark Knight 214. It's not a great story. It's a little bit unbalanced in its comparison of Batman and Deadshot. And I mean, I'm a guy who's been saying for years that Batman and Deadshot are the perfect characters to parallel and have as co-protagonists in a Batman run or Batman story of any kind. And I was really happy to see that at the end of this story, but it's not great. It's not perfectly handled. It's got more of an issue of it acts like it's smarter and more clever than it really is. And if it just played up those themes as opposed to trying to constantly remind you how smart it is, it would have worked a little bit better. So yeah, overall, Deadshot Bulletproof is not great, but it's legitimately interesting, and it's a good place to go, especially if you want to read stuff like Secret Six and you want to get a sense of what Deadshot was like, since that series never really recaps his origin, at least to the best of my knowledge. From all the issues I've read there, you get a lot of good, interesting Deadshot stuff, and you get a lot of interesting relationships between him and Catman, and this does a good job of informing that. However, if you just want to get into Deadshot as a character outside of all of that, then the 80s miniseries collected in Deadshot Beginnings by John Ostrander is far, far superior to this. It's a much more complex story, and it does a lot more with the personality of Deadshot, and you can just read that by itself and say you're a Deadshot fan, because it's such an all-encompassing view of the character. But again, this is not bad. It's just still in the shadow of that story, and that's a bit disappointing. But yeah, overall not bad. The art's great all the way through. The writing with the dialogue and the sense of humor that Christos Gage has is all very fine. So yeah, I'd recommend picking it up, but I would still say go back and pick up Beginnings before you either before you read this, or just as a complement to this, so you can get a better grasp of what you're reading here. Because I have a feeling that if you didn't have any exposure to Deadshot as a character before this, you might still be a little bit confused by the end. It almost sort of assumes that knowledge sometimes and then provides it some other times, and so it's a little bit unbalanced in that way. But yeah, I'd recommend picking it up. It's not incredible or anything, but it's quite good. But let me know what you guys thought in the comments, and let me know if you agree or disagree, and I'll be back with another review next time.